Today, I'm talking to the Reverend Ramelle McCall, Urban Missioner for the Diocese of Maryland and Rector of Holy Trinity in West Baltimore. Thank you, Ramelle, for coming on today to talk about current events and happenings in the world. They're very important at this time, an important part of our faith discussion surrounding race relations. So I'd like to ask you, as an African American man, how are you feeling about the death of George Floyd and other events that are going on, the protests around the world?
Well, thank you, Carrie. I really appreciate this time with you. First off, I'm feeling hurt like many other people of color in this country. After first seeing the video, many people of color like myself say, I really don't want to see another person of color die on video. And then eventually it's shown so many times you see it. And, many people of color like myself, these unfortunate deaths become so unfortunately normalized, especially in very urban environments or other places throughout the country. And so it's hard for many people of color to have any kind of hope of reform. And so I think for me, that was my first feeling. And when I began to start seeing the protesting, um, I saw, well, here we are with this again. But I must admit, I'm truly amazed by the growth, the amount of protests, the diversity of protests that's happening, also the global effect of it. I just saw the other day that there was a huge protest in the UK of
Mhm.
people that were holding up signs saying Black Lives Matter and enough is enough. And so I saw that little peak of hope, but all too often, growing up in West Baltimore, I've seen the wheels of justice not be in everyone's favor. I've seen ones that who are of privilege and money and XYZ are able to get away with all kinds of things, and people who have my particular skin color really do not have the best benefit of the doubt in many circumstances, and it almost has to be argued and articulated, and it's so exhausting because as I heard in one of the news story, how many times do we have to say Black Lives Matter? How many times do we have to
Mm.
keep saying that? And that unfortunately is a sentence that continues to keep echoing through years, throughout my parents' time, throughout people before me, etc. And so I'm personally constantly feeling hurt, um, and many people are just unfortunately used to that, because a lot of times conversations has not been received, and a lot of things that we want others to hear is either just not been fully absorbed, and you've not seen that in policies and so forth. So yeah, there's a whole lot of emotions and trauma around this here, and so we haven't even talked about the coronavirus pandemic, but seeing
Right.
here really is traumatic enough, and the fact that many of us are staying more at home during this pandemic and seeing how it affects us, and it's clear that in every city people are really feeling a certain kind of way about this, north, south, east, and west. And it shows me that I'm definitely not the only one that's feeling frustrated, upset, and sad.
Thank you. You're right. We haven't even talked about the pandemic, all of this happening in the midst of that, which is a whole nother layer and whole nother dimension to the world situation. Ramel, what are your hopes then after seeing all of these protests around the globe and in local communities? What are your hopes for the future? Because as you said, here we go again. But maybe there's some hope that this time things will be different. Maybe not. Tell me your thoughts.
Well, I am grateful to be a Christian because I live the baptismal covenant, which is always full of hope. And I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for prayer. My hope, in response to your question, is that I'm seeing a lot of diversity in people who are really beginning to speak what I call the right narrative. I'm blessed to be urban missioner for the Diocese of Maryland. I've been a part of that particular role for the past 3 years. One of the things that drew me to the role, along with being rector of Holy Trinity, is to be back home in West Baltimore. And West Baltimore has been known for the Freddie Gray uprising. And so it's hard for me not to see how a lot of the protests that's very parallel to what happened in Baltimore over 5 years ago, I believe. And so my hope is now beginning to see that throughout those 5 years, we've had plenty of people talk about the narrative. We have plenty of a lot of think tanks that are happening throughout the country talking about social justice reform and talking about areas like systemic racism. So my hope is that we're kind of getting to the vocabulary and to what I call hashtag learning the right narrative, learning that we cannot go back to normalcy. I use that a lot on Facebook. So people are beginning to absorb the narrative. My hope is now people are beginning to see that seeing these injustices is not just a very one simplistic event. They come from a very pluralistic background. What I mean by that is the word systemic racism. Systemic racism
Mhm.
involves redlining. It involves areas where poverty began to be concentrated, particularly in communities of color. It began to show that there's a huge discrepancy around education and economic wealth. And so you're seeing all of those things come together. Again, I keep talking about this pandemic. What's very different is that this is a pandemic where this particular pandemic is affecting people of color, mortality rates, and so
Yes.
forth. Areas of Baltimore has one of the highest amount of coronavirus cases as we speak. So on top of that, then you've got these ongoing injustices with structural authority is really tough. But again, my hope is now it's clear that people realize reform is so important. Understanding that our judicial system was unfortunately not meant for everybody to have their fair share of equality and justice. And we're beginning to see the huge loopholes on that. People of color have been seeing it for years. But I think others are beginning to realize, okay, it's clear this is not working. We have to now start thinking of how can we begin to do different levels of legislative work on the local level, on the state level, and also on the federal level. And one other thing, I have hope because it's clear that I'm doing what I feel the Spirit wants me to do by building relations with my legislators. I know my council person well. I know my state delegate person well. I know my state senator well. I came and I first made those relations and says, I represent the church. We need to be about those public policy issues that are happening in this zip code. Let's begin to build relations. Let's help build a bridge so that way I, who represent the church, can be a part of those advocate voices in areas like West Baltimore. And I really hope that many others who may wear the collar or are lay people will begin to really exercise their ways of talking to elected officials and really begin to talk to them, regardless of party, but really begin to say, okay, it's clear something is not right, something is disproportionalized, something is absolutely unfair, and something is plain or wrong. So for this one event and this tragic event to make such a huge effect within 1 week, as far as we know, it's not been a month, it's been 1 week, really shows that, wow, there is some particular momentum that's happening. And I believe that hopefully can really cross the finish line on some reform, regardless of what this particular case may come out to be.
Thank you, Ramel. Those are very important, very deep thoughts. Appreciate your sharing them. The Diocesan Truth and Reconciliation Commission this week issued a statement that their charge is to condemn the legacy of chattel slavery, eradicate it, I should say. And the statement is condemning the killing of George Floyd. Um, as a priest in the church, what do you hope we will do as a church? A lot of folks are speaking out across the church. What are your real hopes and dreams for what the church can do, given this current context?
I used to serve on diocesan council, which is one of our gracious committees in each diocese, particularly in the Diocese of Maryland. And it was done several years ago that one of our previous diocesan conventions was to explore a conversation around reparations. And I'm happy to say that there were colleagues, black and white, that were on that particular ad hoc force, that we worked together. We did the research. We've had those conversations. We were so grateful for Bishop Sutton to really have those really tough conversations throughout the diocese. And believe it or not, last year, we unanimously passed a resolution to really begin to materialize some movement around reparations. Every diocese is not doing that. And I hope that we, the church, really begin to not just put aside money, but really begin to put some very clear, important things on the table, so that way every diocese can, at a minimum, have an anti-racism workshop. At a minimum, begin to talk about how that workshop may help reform for any particular police department or other organizations that may not understand their privilege, may not understand their power, may not understand how this is a very powerful tool. And the church, what I truly believe is one of the most powerful tools in our country, can truly be the moral compass at a time like this, to be the moral compass. And so we are believers of faith, and we truly strive for righteousness and justice. And so it's also our role to not just advocate via through protesting, which is really important, but also begin to sit down at the table and talk to the powers that be and begin to start seeing how we can implement real reform in various cases, and particularly throughout the church, areas like reparations, which is a U.S. conversation. Our bishop testified
Hmm.
about that last year at Congress. Really needs to be talked about, in my opinion, in almost every diocese and throughout the church. And so I hope that we really begin to have that conversation, begin to find the right voices. We are blessed with so much diversity, even within our church. And we really need to begin to take advantage of using a lot of the folks that are on the ground doing the gracious work, that are out there meeting people where they are, and really begin to have these conversations. And reparations, among other things, is one of the things I hope that the church can really begin to look into.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the time today to talk to me about what's going on. And God bless you in your ministry
Thank
and
you.
in your life.
Thank you
Thank
very much.
you.
Blessings.